Please, forgive me, the billionaire's voice cracked as he knelt in the mud, rain soaking his expensive suit. You were right, you were the only one who ever tried to save me. This is the heartbreaking story of how a poor black cleaner tried to warn a billionaire CEO about his best friend, and how ignoring her almost destroyed everything. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. And if you love powerful true-to-life stories like this, hit the subscribe button now, drop a like, and let's get started. It was a cold, quiet morning in downtown Chicago. The kind of morning where the skyscrapers looked like they were touching the gray, sleepy clouds. But for Sarah Jenkins, mornings weren't about clouds or skyscrapers. They were about the cold, hard, marble floors of the company she cleaned. Her day started long before the sun even thought about coming up, with the rhythmic swish of her mop on the unappreciated floors of Apex Innovations. Sarah was a tiny woman, but she carried herself with a quiet strength that made her seem taller. Her skin was a deep, warm mahogany, and her eyes, the color of rich coffee, always looked tired but hopeful. A few stray strands of her thick, black hair would always escape from her tight bun, framing a face that was often smudged with dust or streaked with sweat. Her uniform was a simple, loose-fitting gray jumpsuit that swallowed her small frame, but it was clean, and she wore it with a sense of purpose. She was just another shadow in the grand, glass building, a ghost that moved through the silent hallways while the rest of the world slept. The office was her second home, but it was a home she was invisible in. She spent her nights wiping away the footprints and spilled coffee of people who never noticed her, people who would walk right past her in the daytime as if she were a piece of furniture. She would hear them talking on their phones, laughing with their friends, or even complaining about things she wished she had, and it was as if she didn't exist in the same space. Her lunchtime was always the same, a small, dry piece of bread with a bit of cheese, wrapped in a paper towel. She would find a quiet corner, usually in the stairwell, and eat alone. Sometimes, she'd hear the secretaries and young managers talking as they walked past, their voices a muffled buzz of gossip. "Did you hear about the new merger?" one would whisper. "They're buying out that company for a fortune." Another would sigh, "My boss is so demanding. He wants this report by lunch, and I'm not even halfway done." To them, these were big problems. To Sarah, it was a world she was on the outside of, looking in. Her mind, however, was miles away from the spilled coffee and demanding bosses. It was back home, in a small, cramped apartment where her younger brother and sister were still sleeping. Her brother, Michael, was a bright boy with a love for science, always asking questions about how things worked. Her sister, Lily, was a little artist, drawing beautiful pictures on any scrap of paper she could find. They were the reason for the bags under her eyes, the reason she pushed through the exhaustion. She dreamed of a day when she could buy Michael his own telescope and get Lily a whole box of colored pencils, not just the two broken ones they had now. Her wages were a constant, nagging worry. Every dollar was counted, every cent stretched. Rent was a hungry beast that ate up most of her paycheck, leaving just enough to scrape by. She wanted more for her siblings. She wanted them to have opportunities she never had, to go to school and follow their dreams without the weight of poverty on their shoulders. That dream was what kept her going, even on the nights when her back ached and her hands were raw from the cleaning chemicals. As the months passed, Sarah became an expert in the rhythm of the building. She knew when the last straggler would leave, when the night security guard would do his rounds, and when the faint hum of the servers would settle into a steady thrum. She knew the secret hiding places for forgotten mugs and the most efficient way to scrub out a wine stain from the carpet after a late-night celebration. She was a silent guardian of the office, making sure everything was spotless for the people who barely knew her name. One night, the air felt different. It was heavier, quieter. The usual late-night quiet was broken by the sound of voices coming from the main boardroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as Sarah was dusting the paintings on the wall nearby, she heard them. It was a man's voice, low and urgent. It was David, the CEO's best friend, a man known for his flashy suits and loud laugh. She often saw him strolling through the halls, always with a smile and a hand on the shoulder of the CEO, a kind-looking man named Mr. Harrington. Sarah paused, her duster still in her hand. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words carried clearly in the stillness of the night. "You don't understand, Michael." David's voice was tense. "This is our chance. We can't let him mess this up." Then another voice, muffled but clearly Mr. Harrington's, responded. "David, please, we have to do this the right way. It's too big a risk." David's voice grew louder, almost angry. "There is no right way when it comes to a deal this size. We take the money and we run. It's what everyone would do." A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. This wasn't the kind of conversation she was used to hearing. This was different, filled with a tension that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The words "take the money and run" echoed in her mind. David sounded desperate, and Mr. Harrington sounded worried. Sarah quickly moved away from the door, her heart pounding. She had to finish her work and get out of there. But a strange feeling lingered. It was a feeling of unease, of a secret she shouldn't have heard. She had to pretend she hadn't heard anything at all. She was just the cleaner, a ghost in the hallways. No one would ever suspect she had heard a thing. Just as a friendly reminder, if you're enjoying the story, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us bring more stories like this to life. The next morning, the office felt different. A nervous energy hummed through the building, a low, constant buzz that made everyone a little stiffer, a little more careful. The whispers in the hallway were about one thing and one thing only: Michael Harrington's arrival. Michael was the CEO, the man who owned this empire of glass and steel, and his presence was like a sudden burst of sunlight on a cloudy day, intense, bright, and impossible to ignore. Sarah was on her knees, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the marble floor near the main elevators. She had been there for hours, trying to make the floor shine for the day's big entrance. She had heard stories about Michael Harrington, but she had never seen him in person. The workers talked about him like he was a king, and today, he was coming down from his royal suite at the top of the building to walk among them. Suddenly, a hush fell over the entire lobby. The chatter stopped, the tapping of keyboards went silent, and even the elevators seemed to hold their breath. Sarah looked up from her work, and there he was. He was a tall man, with a presence that seemed to fill the whole room. His suit was a dark, expensive charcoal color, and it fit him perfectly, like a second skin. His face was strong and serious, with a clean-shaven jaw and eyes a striking shade of blue that held a powerful focus. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with an effortless authority that made people instinctively stand up a little straighter. He was in his late 30s, but he had the kind of face that had already seen the world and wasn't afraid of what it had shown him. People often said his eyes could see right through you, and as he walked past, it felt like it was true. He didn't look at the floor, or the walls, or the people who were all a part of his world. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, as if he was always looking at a distant, unseen goal. He moved with a quiet power, a sense of purpose that made everyone in the room feel small. The women at the reception desk smiled nervously, and the security guards straightened their jackets. It was clear that he was a man who didn't waste time on small talk or meaningless gestures. He had a goal, and he moved toward it without hesitation. He walked right past Sarah, who was still on her hands and knees, without a single glance in her direction. To him, she was just part of the scenery, another piece of the floor, no more significant than the marble itself. Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she saw a man who seemed so serious, so focused, a man who had built something from nothing and was now in control of it all. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling she had from the night before, the memory of his voice, worried and strained, as he argued with his best friend. As he walked past her, his expensive leather shoes making a soft click on the floor she had just cleaned, a quiet impulse made her speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, a sound that could easily be swallowed by the silence around them. "If only you knew the truth about the man you trust." The words were so soft, so hushed, that even she wasn't sure if she had actually said them out loud. Michael Harrington didn't even flinch. He just kept walking, his mind miles away, his path clear. The words were meant for him, but they were lost in the vastness of the empty space between them. Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. She knew it was a foolish thing to do, but something in her had hoped for just a second of a connection, a moment where he might see her not as a cleaner, but as a person. She went back to her work, the mop suddenly feeling much heavier in her hands. The moment passed, and the nervous energy in the office shifted. Now that the king had made his appearance, everyone could go back to their regular business, even if they were still buzzing about the encounter. Minutes later, just as Michael was about to enter his private elevator, the sound of a voice filled the air. "Michael! My man!" The voice was loud, boisterous, and full of a fake cheerfulness that made Sarah cringe. It was David, the man from the night before. He was a striking contrast to Michael. David was dressed in a flashy, slightly too tight suit that screamed money, but not good taste. His smile was wide and a little too perfect, and his eyes, a light shade of green, seemed to be constantly looking for something, for an angle, for an opportunity. He moved with a loud, confident swagger, a stark difference from Michael's quiet power. He was the kind of person who always wanted to be the center of attention. David hurried over to Michael, a huge grin on his face. Michael, for the first time since he had entered the building, broke his serious expression. A genuine smile, warm and true, spread across his face as he opened his arms. He embraced David in a firm, powerful hug, the kind of hug you give to someone you have known your whole life. "My brother for life," Michael said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "I'm so glad you're here." David patted him on the back, a fake laugh rumbling in his chest. "Of course, brother. I wouldn't miss this for the world." The moment was perfect, a picture of two best friends, two brothers, a symbol of loyalty and trust. To everyone who saw it, it was a heartwarming sight. But to Sarah, who was still mopping the floor in the corner, it felt like a cold dagger in her heart. She knew what she had heard. She had heard the tension and the anger in David's voice. She had heard him talk about taking the money and running. And now, she saw Michael, the serious, powerful CEO, smiling with genuine warmth at the man who was plotting against him. Michael didn't just see David as a business partner. He saw him as family. It was a loyalty that made Sarah's stomach turn. She wanted to yell, to scream, to tell him to be careful, but she couldn't. She was just the cleaner. The invisible cleaner. Her words were just a whisper in the wind, a warning no one would ever hear. She watched them walk away together, side by side, and she felt a sense of dread for the kind man who had no idea what was waiting for him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The company was on the verge of closing a massive deal, a business agreement so huge it was the talk of the entire office. Everyone was buzzing with excitement, and a big part of that buzz was about David, the best friend. It was like he had become the main character in the story of Apex Innovations. David was everywhere. He moved through the office with a confidence that seemed to light up the room. He was the life of every conversation, the center of every group. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and walk out with a dozen new friends. His charm was like a superpower. He'd laugh a little too loudly at his own jokes, but people would laugh with him anyway. He'd slap backs and shake hands, remembering everyone's name, from the new intern to the senior vice president. Sarah watched it all from her quiet corner. During the day, she was busy doing the small jobs that no one else wanted to do, cleaning up spills in the break room, organizing the supply closets, and polishing the glass walls of the conference rooms. She saw how the workers looked at David. Their admiration was clear in their eyes. She heard them talking in hushed, awestruck tones. "He's amazing," one young woman whispered to her friend as David passed by, a wide smile on his face. "He's so smart, and he's so down to earth." Another worker, a man who had been with the company for years, nodded in agreement. "He's the real backbone of this empire," he said. "Michael is the face, but David is the one who makes everything happen behind the scenes." It was a common opinion. Everyone believed that Michael Harrington, the quiet, serious CEO, was brilliant, but that David was the one with the street smarts, the one who truly understood how the world worked. She saw him in the meeting rooms, talking to important-looking people in expensive suits. She heard him talking about the big deal, using words that sounded complicated but were about a simple thing: money. He spoke with such passion and conviction, explaining how this deal would not only make the company rich but would also make all the workers' lives better. He talked about new opportunities, bigger paychecks, and a brighter future for everyone. It was a good show. He made everyone believe he was on their side. Sarah, however, couldn't shake the memory of his voice from the night before, filled with tension and greed. She remembered him saying, "We take the money and we run." The words felt so out of place with the person everyone else saw. It was like she was watching two different movies at the same time. One was a feel-good story about a successful best friend, and the other was a dark, suspenseful drama about a secret betrayal. One afternoon, she was dusting the frames of the photos in the main hallway. The photos were of Michael and David, younger and with bigger smiles, at company events and parties. They were standing side by side, their arms around each other's shoulders. In one photo, Michael was helping David tie his tie. In another, they were holding up a big check for a charity they had donated to. They looked like true brothers, two friends who had built an empire together, step by step, from the ground up. A deep sadness settled in Sarah's heart. She knew what it was like to have a dream, to want something so badly you could taste it. Michael had a dream, and he had trusted his best friend, his brother, to help him achieve it. But what if David's dream was a completely different one? One that would leave Michael's dream in ruins? As the day came to an end, the building slowly emptied out. The high-energy buzz of the day faded into a quiet stillness. Sarah started her nightly routine, the rhythmic swish of her mop, a familiar, comforting sound. She was in the executive wing, a part of the office that was always the last to empty. The lights were mostly off, and the shadows were long and deep. She was just finishing up near the private elevator that led to the top floors when she heard the faint click of a door. It was David's office. He stepped out and looked around, his head turning quickly from side to side. His usual easy smile was gone. His face was a hard mask of concentration, and his eyes darted like a thief's, scanning the empty hallway. He was checking to see if anyone was around, if anyone was watching. Sarah quickly ducked behind a large plant in the corner, holding her breath. She didn't want to be seen. He moved quickly, his movements sharp and calculated. He walked to a small, hidden safe behind a painting on the wall. He opened it, and as he reached inside, Sarah's eyes widened. He pulled out a thick, brown envelope. It was not a normal office envelope. It was thick, stuffed with what looked like papers, maybe even cash. It was the kind of envelope you see in movies, the kind that holds a secret. He looked around one more time, his gaze sweeping over the spot where Sarah was hiding, but he didn't see her. He slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He buttoned it up, straightened his tie, and then, as if nothing had happened, a faint, chilling smile crossed his lips. He walked to the private elevator, his shadow long and thin behind him. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside, the light of the elevator reflecting in his eyes, which were no longer filled with charm but with a cold, calculating look that made Sarah's blood run cold. She waited until the elevator doors closed, and the soft hum of the lift faded away. She was frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The memory of the envelope, of David's furtive, nervous movements, was burned into her mind. She had seen him with Michael, so trusting and warm. She had seen him with the workers, so charming and kind. But what she had just seen was the real David, a man with a secret, a man who was hiding something big and dangerous in a simple brown envelope. The truth was starting to unravel, and Sarah, the invisible cleaner, was the only one who had seen it. The office was so quiet at night that you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant hum of the city outside. For Sarah, this was her usual workspace, but tonight, the silence felt different. It was heavy, and it was filled with the unsettling memory of the brown envelope David had pocketed just a few nights before. It was a secret she was carrying, and it weighed on her mind as she went about her duties. She had finished cleaning the main floors and was now making her rounds to empty the trash cans in the smaller offices and conference rooms. The weight of the evening felt like a physical thing on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to be extra careful, extra quiet. Her eyes were constantly darting around, looking for shadows, for movement, for anything that didn't belong. As she walked down a long, narrow hallway, she saw a faint light coming from a small meeting room that was rarely used. It was David's voice, low and urgent, coming from inside. He was on the phone, and his words were barely a whisper, but they cut through the stillness like a knife. Sarah's heart started to pound in her chest, a nervous drumbeat that seemed to get louder with every step she took. She held her breath and moved silently, her worn shoes making no sound on the polished floors. She stopped by the half-open door, staying hidden in the shadows of the hallway. David was pacing back and forth, his face tight with a mix of fear and impatience. He was still in his expensive suit, but it looked rumpled and messy now, as if he had been through a long and stressful day. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a scowl. He held his phone to his ear, his voice barely a murmur. "Listen to me," he said, the words sharp and pointed. "You have to move the money. Do it tonight. Don't wait." Sarah's stomach dropped. Move the funds was a phrase that sounded important and dangerous, but in her world, it meant one thing: taking money. And the way he said it, with such a dark urgency, made it sound like he was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. He wasn't talking about a simple bank transfer. He was talking about something big, something secret. The voice on the other end of the line was a muffled series of beeps and static, but David's end of the conversation was crystal clear. "I don't care about the risk. He won't suspect a thing. He trusts me completely. That's the whole point." He let out a bitter, joyless laugh. "He thinks he's getting a great deal. By the time he finds out, it'll be too late. The deal will be done, the money will be gone, and we'll be in the clear." Fear, cold and sharp, ran down Sarah's spine. This was not a small lie, not a tiny secret. This was a grand, evil betrayal. He wasn't just talking about a business deal. He was talking about stealing from his best friend. The man he called brother. The kind, quiet Michael Harrington who had shown him nothing but loyalty and trust. David was planning to take everything from him, to ruin him. She watched him as he walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. His face was a mask of cold, calculating greed. She saw a man who was willing to throw away years of friendship, loyalty, and trust for the sake of money. The picture of them as young men, laughing and sharing a dream, flashed in her mind. It was a lie. All of it was a lie. He walked back to his desk, running a hand through his hair in a frustrated motion. "Just do it. I'll call you when it's done. And don't mess this up. This is our one shot." He hung up the phone, and for a moment, he just stood there in the dark room, a statue of a man consumed by his own ambition. Sarah's mind was racing. The words betrayal, deception, and theft screamed in her head. She had to do something. She had to warn Michael. But how? She was nobody. She was the cleaner, a ghost in the hallways. Who would listen to her? What proof did she have? A whispered conversation in the dark? A brown envelope? No one would believe her over David, the charming, beloved backbone of the company. Her heart was pounding so hard she was afraid he would hear it. She knew she had to get out of there. She took a step back, her foot making a tiny, barely audible squeak on the polished floor. It was enough. David's head snapped up. His eyes, sharp and alert, darted toward the door. He wasn't looking for a person, he was looking for a sound. He had been so lost in his thoughts, so consumed by his plan, that the tiniest noise made him jump. Panic seized Sarah. She was caught. She had been foolish, she had stayed too long. She needed to get out of there, fast. She turned and silently, as quickly as she could, she crept down the hallway, her breathing shallow, her body tense. She moved like a shadow, her body pressed against the wall, her hands trembling. She heard the sound of the meeting room door opening and a faint whisper of a voice. "Hello, he called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. Sarah didn't dare turn back. She kept moving, her legs carrying her faster and faster down the long corridor, away from the light, away from the danger. She reached the end of the hallway and slipped into the stairwell, her heart in her throat. She closed the heavy door behind her, the soft whoosh of air a loud sound in the stillness. She leaned against the cool metal of the door, her hand shaking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had escaped. He hadn't seen her. But she knew that something had changed. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a witness. She was a threat. And she had a feeling that David, the charming, treacherous best friend, was now looking for the person who had overheard his darkest secret. She was alone in this fight, and the clock was ticking. The night was long and restless for Sarah. She lay in her small, cramped bed, but her mind was wide awake, replaying the scene in the hallway over and over again. The image of David, his eyes darting like a thief's and his voice sharp with a dark secret, was burned into her memory. She couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had gripped her in that moment. It was a kind of fear that didn't go away, a cold knot in her stomach that kept her from sleeping. Her home, which was usually a place of comfort and safety, felt small and suffocating. She could hear the quiet snores of her younger siblings from the other room, and the sound made her heart ache. She had a responsibility to them. Her whole world was about providing for them, making sure they had enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. Her job was everything. It was the one thing that stood between them and a life of even harder struggle. A thought kept nagging at her, what if David saw her? What if he suspected? He had seemed to sense something. What would he do to her if he found out she had heard everything? The thought of losing her job, of being out on the streets with nothing, was terrifying. She had worked so hard to get here, to have this one source of income. She considered staying silent. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. It was a matter between two powerful men, a game she had no place in. She was just the cleaner. What could she do? She knew that people like Michael Harrington, the CEO of a huge company, didn't take advice from people like her. She was a ghost, a nobody. Her opinion meant nothing. She could go back to her job, keep her head down, and pretend she never heard anything. It was the only way to protect herself and her family. But then, another voice, a much older and wiser voice, echoed in her mind. It was her mother's. She remembered a time when she was just a little girl, so scared of standing up to a bully in school. Her mother, a strong and gentle woman with hands that were always working, had held her face in her hands and looked her in the eye. Sarah, she had said, always remember this. Speak truth, even if your voice shakes. It's the only way to live. Her mother's words felt like a warm hand on her heart, a steadying force in the middle of a storm. Her mother had lived a hard life, but she had always been an honest woman. She had taught Sarah that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing. Lying there in the dark, Sarah knew she couldn't pretend. She couldn't stay silent while a good man was being betrayed. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about right and wrong. It was about saving someone from a terrible lie. Her heart was pounding, a nervous, unsteady beat, but a new kind of resolve was forming inside of her. She wasn't a brave person, not in the way heroes in movies were brave. But she had a quiet courage, a strength that came from a love for her family and a deep sense of what was fair. She would have to do something. The question was, what? She spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, trying to come up with a plan. She couldn't just walk up to Michael and say, "Your best friend is a thief." She had no proof. He would just think she was crazy. She needed a way to get his attention, to make him listen to her. But how? She was just a cleaner. She didn't have an office, she didn't have a phone number, she didn't have a way to make an appointment. She was just a shadow. The next morning, she got ready for work like she did every day, but her heart was beating faster. She put on her grey jumpsuit, tied her hair back in its usual tight bun, and took a deep breath. Today was the day. She would have to take a chance. When she arrived at the office, she was on a mission. She cleaned the lobby, polished the elevator doors, and then she waited. Her plan was simple, maybe even foolish. She would wait for Michael Harrington to come down to his office, and she would find a way to be in the same elevator as him. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She stood near the executive elevators, pretending to be wiping down the glass walls, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Minutes turned into an eternity. Finally, the private elevator at the end of the hall dinged, and the doors slid open. There he was. Michael Harrington, the powerful CEO, dressed in a sharp suit, a serious look on his face. He walked out and began to walk toward the main elevators, his mind clearly on 1,000 different things. Sarah knew this was her only chance. She took a deep breath, dropped her cleaning rag on the floor, and rushed to the elevator just as the doors were about to close. She slipped inside just in time, her body brushing past his for a brief moment. She stood in the corner of the elevator, her back to the wall, her eyes on the floor. Michael didn't seem to notice her at first. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, lost in thought. The air in the small elevator was thick with silence. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her chest. Her hands were shaking. Her lips were trembling. She had the truth on her tongue, but the words were stuck in her throat, held there by fear and the powerful reality of the situation. Who was she to tell a billionaire what to do? What right did she have to speak? She looked up at him. His eyes were focused on the numbers of the floors as they passed by. He looked tired, worn out. He didn't look like a greedy billionaire, he looked like a man who was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. The weight of his company, the weight of his dreams. He looked human. The elevator slowed down, approaching his floor. It was now or never. Sarah's lips parted, and a single, trembling word escaped her mouth. "Sir." He finally turned his head, his blue eyes meeting hers for the first time. The look on his face was one of surprise, a mix of curiosity and slight annoyance. He was about to ask her what she wanted, to tell her to get back to work. But he didn't get a chance. The elevator doors opened on his floor, and he was about to step out. Sarah's heart sank. She had missed her chance. He would leave, and she would be alone in the elevator, the words still stuck in her throat. The elevator doors were open, and the cold, powerful air of the executive floor rushed in. Michael Harrington was about to step out, to go back to his world of high-stakes deals and important meetings, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing right under his nose. Sarah knew this was her last chance. She had to do it. Her mother's words, "Speak truth, even if your voice shakes," rang in her ears, louder than any fear. She took a shaky breath, her hand still trembling, and the words tumbled out of her mouth, a desperate, breathless rush. "Sir, please, you have to listen to me. Your friend, he's planning something. He's going to hurt you. Please be careful." Michael stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, he really looked at Sarah. He saw her worn uniform, the fear in her eyes, the simple rag still clutched in her hand. A small, puzzled frown creased his forehead. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, taking her in, as if she were a piece of the building he had never noticed before. Then, a small, humorless smile crossed his lips. He let out a short, sharp burst of laughter. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a laugh of disbelief, of a man who was so sure of his world that a simple truth from a simple person sounded like a joke. "You?" "A cleaner," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. He looked at her from head to toe, the look on his face a mix of pity and mockery. "You're a cleaner, and you're here to give me, the CEO, a warning about my best friend." His voice was loud now, and it bounced off the polished floors and glass walls, carrying the weight of his power and authority. The words were like a physical blow. "Judging my best friend." He shook his head, a look of disappointment on his face. "David? My brother? The man who has stood by my side for 20 years? You think you know him better than I do." He took a step back, and the space between them seemed to grow wider. He saw her, not as a person, but as an invisible part of his life who had suddenly become a nuisance. He saw her as someone who was stepping out of her place, someone who was crossing a line. The words were spoken with a tone that said, "Go back to your job, stop talking nonsense, and don't ever do this again." Sarah felt her face grow hot with shame. Her heart was in her throat, and she felt a deep, burning humiliation. She had tried. She had been brave, and this was the result. She was a joke. A fool. The man she was trying to save was laughing at her, and his voice was full of a cold, condescending disbelief. She had dared to step out of the shadows, and she was being pushed back in, hard. A few office workers had started to emerge from their cubicles, drawn by the sound of Michael's voice. They stood in the hallway, whispering, their eyes wide with curiosity. They looked at Sarah and then at Michael, and it was clear what they were thinking. They saw a crazy cleaner trying to talk to the most powerful man in the building. They saw a woman who was out of her mind. The humiliation was a heavy cloak on her shoulders, but something deep inside her refused to break. She had faced harder things in her life than a man's scorn. She had faced hunger, poverty, and the constant worry of not having enough. This was just a man's laugh, and it was a small price to pay for speaking the truth. She stood there for a long moment, the ridicule washing over her. She didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. The words were out and they had been rejected. She simply looked at him, her tired, brown eyes holding a steady gaze. The fear was gone now, replaced by a quiet and powerful conviction. She knew what she had heard. She knew what she had seen. And she knew that one day, he would remember this moment. She turned around slowly and walked away. She didn't run, she didn't rush. She walked with a quiet dignity, her head held high. She was still just the cleaner, but she was a cleaner who had dared to speak. She walked past the whispering workers, past the gleaming walls she had polished, and she got back into the elevator. Michael stood there, watching her go. His laughter had faded, replaced by a strange silence. The conviction in her eyes, it was unsettling. It wasn't the look of a person who was lying. It was the look of a person who was telling the truth. He had expected her to break down, to apologize, to scurry away like a frightened mouse. But she hadn't. She had simply walked away, leaving her words hanging in the air. He went to his office, but the usual focus he had was gone. The image of the little cleaner's face, so filled with a deep and certain belief, kept coming back to him. He shook his head, trying to get the thought out of his mind. It was absurd. David was his best friend. His brother. He trusted him with his life. He was being ridiculous, letting the words of a stranger bother him. But as he sat down at his grand desk, the feeling of unease settled in his stomach like a cold, hard stone. The night fell on Chicago, painting the city in shades of deep blue and inky black. Up in his sprawling mansion, a fortress of glass and steel that looked out over the glittering lights of the city, Michael Harrington was alone. He wasn't in his usual grand study or the expensive home theater. He was in his library, a quiet, personal space filled with books he never had the time to read. He was sitting in a comfortable leather chair, a glass of amber-colored whiskey in his hand, the ice making a soft, clinking sound in the quiet room. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was loud with the echo of a voice he couldn't get out of his head. The voice of a simple cleaner. "Sir, your friend, he's planning something. Please be careful." He took a long sip of his drink, the warm liquid doing nothing to calm the cold knot in his stomach. He had laughed at her. He had dismissed her, made a joke of her warning. He had been so sure, so certain of his world, that the idea of David, his best friend, doing anything to harm him was just absurd. It was unthinkable. But now, in the stillness of the night, with no one to impress and no one to judge him, her words kept coming back. They were like little seeds, planted in his mind, and now, in the quiet darkness, they were beginning to grow. He had tried to brush them off, to tell himself it was just a random person looking for attention, but the look in her eyes, that look of absolute, unwavering conviction, it was what haunted him. It wasn't a look of a person trying to make up a story. It was the look of a person telling the honest truth, a truth that was difficult and painful to speak. He remembered the meeting in the boardroom the other night. The way David had been so impatient, so desperate to get the deal done. Michael had wanted to be careful, to make sure every detail was perfect, but David had pushed and pushed, telling him to just take the money and run. He had used those exact words. At the time, Michael had just thought it was David's way of talking, his a little too eager business talk. But now, it sounded different. It sounded like a plan. And then there were the phone calls. He remembered countless times when David would step out of a room to take a call, his voice low and secretive. Whenever Michael would ask who it was, David would just smile and say, "Oh, just a personal thing. Nothing to worry about." Michael, a man who trusted his best friend completely, had never thought to question it. He had always taken David at his word, never doubting him for a second. But now, those phone calls seemed less innocent. They seemed like secrets being kept in the shadows. Michael walked over to the large window, staring out at the city below. He had built this company from nothing, with his bare hands and his sharp mind. But he hadn't done it alone. He and David had started as college kids with a wild idea. They had been partners in everything, through good times and bad. David had been his rock, his confidant, his brother. The idea that David would betray him was like a physical blow to his heart. It felt like his entire world was being turned upside down. He thought back to the little cleaner's face. He didn't even know her name. He had never seen her face before that day. But she had risked her job, her well-being, to give him a warning. Why? What could she possibly have to gain? The answer was nothing. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And that, more than anything, was what gave her words weight. A heavy feeling settled in his chest. He felt sick. It was a terrible, lonely feeling. It was the feeling of realizing that the person you trusted more than anyone else might be a complete stranger. He couldn't just ignore this anymore. He couldn't go on pretending. The seeds of doubt had taken root, and he knew he had to do something about it. He had to find out the truth. He had to know, once and for all, if the man he called his brother was a snake. He set his glass down on the table, the sharp sound a final decision. He couldn't confront David directly. He was too smart, too good at lying. David would just laugh and call him paranoid, and Michael would feel like a fool all over again. He had to be careful. He had to find proof. He had to test him, without him ever knowing that he was being tested. He thought about the deal. The big, multi-million-dollar business agreement that was supposed to be the biggest triumph of their lives. David had been in charge of the final details. He had been so secretive about the paperwork, saying he wanted to surprise Michael with the final numbers. It had seemed so sweet at the time. Now it felt like a trap. He began to wonder if he was going crazy. Was he being paranoid? Was he letting the words of a stranger ruin a 20-year friendship? He looked out at the city lights again, and they didn't look so bright and beautiful anymore. They looked cold and distant. He felt completely alone, a powerful man in a big house, with a terrible, growing suspicion in his heart. The test would be the only way to find out. But he was terrified of what he would find. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lobby of Apex Innovations, but the light seemed to bounce right off of David's expensive suit and his big, bright smile. He walked into the office like a king, and the nervous energy that had been hanging in the air for days seemed to disappear the moment he arrived. He was back to being the charming, confident partner everyone knew and loved. He had a stack of papers under his arm, a large, wrapped box in his hand, and a laugh that was a little too loud, but nobody seemed to mind. Michael was waiting for him in his office. He had spent a sleepless night replaying Sarah's words, his heart heavy with doubt. He had a plan, a small test to see if his best friend was who he claimed to be. But seeing David now, so full of energy and cheer, made him question his own sanity. It felt like he was a little boy playing a silly game of detective, and all he wanted was for his friend to prove him wrong. David burst into the office, his smile wider than ever. "Michael, My man, he said, placing the documents and the gift box on the desk with a dramatic flourish. I have amazing news. The deal is done. The last of the paperwork is signed, and we're officially in business with the new investors. It's a goldmine, brother, a real goldmine. He was a whirlwind of motion, shaking Michael's hand with a firm grip and slapping him on the back. The other workers who had followed them into the office were beaming. The company was on the verge of a huge win, and David was the one who had delivered it. They all looked at him with admiration, a silent chorus of "I told you so." I even brought you a little something to celebrate, David said, his eyes sparkling with a fake sincerity that Michael was now just beginning to notice. He pushed the gift box toward Michael. Open it. Michael unwrapped the box slowly. Inside was a sleek, silver watch. It was beautiful, a timepiece that looked expensive and powerful. It's a new investment, David said, winking. We both deserve it after all this hard work. Michael looked at the watch, and a strange feeling came over him. The gift felt like a bribe, a way to make him forget everything else. It felt like a prop in a play, a part of a performance that David was putting on for him and everyone else. He had to be careful. He couldn't show his hand. He had to play along. He forced a small smile. Thank you, David, he said, his voice flat. It's beautiful. David seemed to pick up on the slight hesitation in his voice. His smile didn't falter, but his green eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. What's wrong, brother? You don't sound happy. Did you think I was going to lose the deal? You know I'd never let you down. Michael shook his head. No. It's not that. It's just a lot to take in. It's a big deal. David let out a loud laugh, the kind that was meant to be heard across the room. A big deal? Michael, we've been working toward this for years. You trust me, don't you? You're not letting some of the crazy whispers in the office get to you, are you? He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. People get jealous, you know. They see two friends at the top, and they want to bring them down. You can't listen to them. Then, he straightened up, a proud look on his face. Who else would die for you but me? We're family, Michael. We've been through everything together. We built this company from nothing, with our own two hands. We're a team. He was using all the right words. He was saying all the things that a loyal friend would say. The words were a thick, comforting blanket, a way to wrap Michael back in the old feelings of trust and brotherhood. And for a moment, Michael almost fell for it. He almost let go of the doubt, of the cold feeling in his gut. But then he remembered Sarah's face. The conviction in her eyes. It was a truth that felt stronger than all of David's empty, beautiful words. Just then, David's cell phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his face, for just a fleeting second, changed completely. The confident smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard mask. He looked panicked, and he quickly turned his back to Michael, walking toward the large window. Hold on a second, will you? He said, his voice now a low, urgent murmur. He held the phone to his ear and spoke in a strange, low whisper. It's done, move it to the third account, use the code of Project Phoenix, he's celebrating, he won't look at the details until tomorrow, good, now make sure you wipe the transaction, make it look like a regular payment, okay, good. Now hang up. Michael's heart stopped. He wasn't supposed to hear that. He was just supposed to be looking at the beautiful watch. But he had heard it all. The words were a mix of business jargon and code words, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. Move the funds tonight. Project Phoenix, wipe the transaction, make it look like a regular payment. It all sounded like a secret, a cover-up. It all sounded like a betrayal. David turned back around, a fake, easy smile back on his face. Sorry about that, brother. Just a quick call about, the usual. But Michael wasn't smiling. He was staring at David, his blue eyes no longer full of trust, but with a growing, cold fury. The watch on his desk felt heavy, a symbol of a lie. The words of the cleaner, which he had so easily dismissed, now felt like the only truth he had ever known. He had tested his friend, and in a simple phone call, his best friend had failed. The perfect facade of a loyal friend had just cracked, and underneath, there was a man he didn't even recognize. The days that followed felt like a slow-motion disaster. The big, beautiful deal that was supposed to make Apex Innovations a fortune was now a mess. The investors who had signed on with so much enthusiasm were suddenly pulling out, one by one. The phone on Michael's desk rang constantly, but it wasn't with good news. It was with a lot of bad news. The voice on the other end was always the same: "We're sorry, Mr. Harrington, but we've decided to withdraw from the deal." There were some inconsistencies. Michael was a wreck. He worked around the clock, trying to figure out what was going wrong. He went over the paperwork 100 times, looking for a mistake, a tiny error he could fix. But everything looked perfect. The numbers, the signatures, the agreements, it all looked solid. The business world was a cold, cruel place, and he knew that deals could fall apart for no reason at all. But this was different. This felt like it was being done on purpose. While the empire was crumbling around him, Sarah was still just the cleaner, a ghost in the hallways. She worked her usual night shift, moving through the silent offices and conference rooms. But her routine was no longer a mindless one. She was a quiet detective now, her eyes and ears open, looking for any sign of trouble. The whispered phone call, the secret envelope, they were a constant reminder that this wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was a person, a very trusted person, who was deliberately ruining everything. She noticed things that no one else would. The financial papers on Michael's desk, which were always neat and tidy, were now a mess. They were shuffled strangely, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry. She saw one thick file in particular that was sitting on top of the pile. It was a folder for the company's asset transfers, the official papers for moving money. She knew what that meant from her nightly research. She had been listening to the news on her little phone, and she had read articles about how some companies move their money around. It was a complex dance of numbers and codes, and it was a way for people to hide what they were really doing with their money. One night, as she was emptying the trash in Michael's office, she saw something sticking out of the top of the bin. It was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an invoice. In her line of work, she was used to seeing things that were meant to be thrown away. But this was different. This wasn't crumpled up. It was just a little folded, as if it had been discarded in a hurry. It was an invoice for something called Project Phoenix, with a huge amount of money written on it. A chill ran down her spine. Project Phoenix. That was the code word David had whispered into his phone that night. She carefully, silently, took the invoice out of the trash. She unfolded it, her heart pounding in her chest. The numbers were staggering. It was a paper trail, a record of a huge amount of money being moved. It was the proof she needed. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was a smoking gun. She held the piece of paper in her hand, her mind racing. This was it. This was the proof she needed to show Michael. This was the one piece of evidence that could make him believe her. She had to get this to him. She had to. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the paper. Just as she was about to fold the paper and put it in her pocket, she heard the soft whoosh of the office door opening. She froze. It was David. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face a hard mask in the dim light. He had a glass of something in his hand, and he was staring at the pile of papers on Michael's desk with a look of intense concentration. He had come back to check on his handiwork, to make sure his grand betrayal was still on track. He looked up, and his eyes fell on Sarah. He saw her standing there, frozen in fear, holding the piece of paper. His smile, the perfect mask he always wore, vanished. His eyes, the usual friendly green, went cold and hard as stone. The look he gave her was one she had never seen before. It wasn't a look of annoyance or dismissal. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear and anger. He now saw her not as a ghost, not as a cleaner, but as a threat. The woman who had heard his secrets, the one who was now holding the proof of his crime. She felt a jolt of panic. She was trapped. She was in his office, in the middle of the night, with the evidence of his crime in her hands. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the glass still in his hand, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah knew that her life, and the life of her family, had just been put in terrible danger. There was no escaping him now. The next morning, the office was buzzing with a nervous tension that was almost as thick as the morning fog outside. Sarah felt it the moment she walked through the doors. Everyone was looking at her, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and suspicion. They had all heard what had happened between her and Michael Harrington, the CEO. They knew she had tried to warn him about his best friend, and they had all seen how she had been laughed at and dismissed. Now, the atmosphere felt like a ticking time bomb. She was just doing her rounds, trying to act like everything was normal, but her heart was pounding. She knew David was in the office. He had a look on his face yesterday that was a silent warning, a look that said, "I know what you've done, and you're going to pay for it." She just didn't know how or when the punishment would come. Meanwhile, in Michael's office, the air was thick with a fake kindness that felt colder than any anger. David was there, looking worried and concerned. He was pacing back and forth, holding his hands up in a gesture of fake innocence. "Michael, you have to do something," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Your cleaner, she's trouble. I saw her last night. She was snooping through your documents. She was in your office, going through your private papers. Who knows what she's taken?" He was a master at the game. He was twisting the truth just enough to make it sound like a lie. He didn't mention the invoice. He didn't mention the fact that he was in the office, too. He just put all the blame on her, painting a picture of her as a sneaky, untrustworthy person. "She's trying to cause problems. She's trying to turn you against me. She's spreading lies about me behind my back. You have to get rid of her. For the company's sake, and for our friendship." Michael was torn. A part of him, the part that had seen the conviction in Sarah's eyes, wanted to believe her. But the other part, the part that had a 20-year history with David, was fighting back. He was confused and hurt. The company was crumbling, and his best friend was telling him that a cleaner was the cause of all his problems. It sounded crazy, but the more David talked, the more it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. He had to be strong. He had to make a choice, and he chose the person he had known the longest. He chose his friend. He stood up, his face grim, and he walked out of his office with David right behind him. The rest of the staff saw them coming and all fell silent. Michael looked around the room, his eyes dark with frustration and anger. He needed to make a statement. He needed to show everyone that he was still in control, that he wasn't going to let a little lie tear his world apart. His eyes found Sarah, who was polishing a glass wall on the other side of the lobby. He walked straight toward her, his footsteps loud and heavy in the sudden silence. Sarah felt a jolt of panic. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. He stopped right in front of her. She looked up at him, her heart in her throat. His eyes, once so cold and distant, were now blazing with a raw, powerful anger. It was an anger that was meant to crush her. "You," he said, his voice loud and clear, echoing through the large, open space. "What were you doing in my office last night? What were you looking for?" Sarah's voice was a whisper. "Sir, I can explain. I found something. It's the proof." He was planning something. Planning something. Michael's voice was full of a bitter, mocking tone. He turned to the other workers who were watching, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. "She says my best friend, the man who helped me build this company from the ground up, is a thief." He turned back to her, his voice rising, a sharp, angry crack. "You're a liar. You're a gossip. And you're spreading lies in my company just because you have nothing better to do with your time." The words hit her like a physical slap. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt. and his hurt was turning into a terrible rage. "I told you to be careful," he said, his voice lower now, but with an intensity that was even more terrifying. "And you came back and caused more trouble. You're a problem. And you're fired." The word fired hung in the air, a final, crushing blow. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Her job, her only source of income, her whole reason for being here, gone. Just like that. In front of everyone. Her humiliation was complete. Tears, hot and stinging, welled up in her eyes, and she felt them run down her cheeks, a public display of her defeat. "And don't you ever spread lies in my company again," he said. The finality in his voice was a clear end to the conversation. She just stood there for a moment, the tears falling silently down her face. She felt a deep, profound sadness. Not just for herself, but for him. He was blind. He had chosen a lie over the truth, and he had thrown away the one person who was trying to save him. She dropped her cleaning rag and turned away, walking out of the building. She walked past the whispering, judging faces of the staff, past the reception desk where they looked away, past the front door, and into the cold, grey air of the city. As she stepped out onto the sidewalk, she heard a soft, muffled sound behind her. She didn't turn back, but she knew what it was. It was David's laughter. She knew he was standing there, watching her walk away. The last thing she remembered was the sound of his laughter and his sly, triumphant grin. His plan was nearly complete. He had removed the only threat, the only person who could have stopped him. He had won. And a part of Michael's empire, a small but important part, had just been torn away. The morning sun didn't feel warm. It felt cold and distant, a pale light shining on a city that was about to wake up to a terrible truth. For Michael Harrington, that truth came in the form of a breaking news report on the giant television screen in his office. He had just arrived, his head pounding from a sleepless night filled with regret and confusion. He sat at his desk, staring at the screen, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. The news anchor's voice was sharp and urgent. "Breaking news from Wall Street," she said, her face grim. "Financial experts are reporting a massive breach at one of the city's largest companies, Apex Innovations. Sources say millions, possibly tens of millions, of dollars have been siphoned from company accounts in what appears to be a sophisticated theft." Michael's blood ran cold. The word siphoned was a technical term he knew very well. It meant that money had been taken, secretly and slowly, from one place to another. He felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just been wrong. He had been played. He stood up from his desk, his legs feeling weak, and walked to the window. The city below, which had always felt like his own personal kingdom, now seemed like a hostile, dangerous place. He looked down and saw a swarm of black cars pulling up to the front of his building. The people getting out of them weren't his usual visitors. They were dressed in dark suits, and they had serious, grim faces. They were government agents, men and women who dealt with big, complicated crimes. They were here for him. They were here for his company. Chaos erupted in the lobby. The workers, who had been chatting and laughing just moments before, were now screaming. They were looking at their phones, at the news reports, and then at each other. They were seeing their jobs, their livelihoods, and their futures disappearing before their very eyes. Panic spread through the building like a wildfire. Michael's phone began to ring non-stop. It wasn't his usual calls from his staff or his business partners. It was from his investors. They were angry, their voices filled with a cold, terrifying rage. They wanted their money back. They wanted answers. They were pulling their investments out of the company, and with every call, Michael could feel his world crumbling. The stock market, a place where his company had once stood tall, was now a place of ruin. The company's stock, once a symbol of its strength, was crashing, the numbers falling faster than he could even comprehend. He tried to call David, but the line was busy. He tried again. No answer. He felt a terrible sense of dread. He had been so blind. So stupid. He had laughed at the one person who had tried to save him. He had chosen a lie over the truth, and now he was paying the price. He walked out of his office, his mind in a fog. He stood in the middle of the executive floor, watching as his empire fell apart around him. He saw the government agents moving through the offices, putting documents into boxes. He saw the workers crying, their faces a mix of terror and disbelief. He saw his own dream, the one he had worked for his entire life, turning into a nightmare. He had built something beautiful, and now it was all in ruins. And through all the chaos, one single, devastating thought kept coming back to him. He remembered the humiliation on Sarah's face, the tears in her eyes as he fired her. He remembered her simple words, full of a quiet, powerful truth. He's planning something. Please be careful. He had dismissed her, called her a liar, and sent her away in disgrace. He had protected a man who was now nowhere to be found, a man who had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. He looked around at the chaos, at the destruction he had helped to create. He saw a government agent holding a picture of him and David, a picture he had hung on his wall just a few days ago. The picture was of them smiling, their arms around each other, a symbol of their so-called brotherhood. The agent looked at the picture and then at him, a cold, knowing look on his face. The reality of what he had done, and what he had lost, hit him with a powerful force. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the company. It was the fact that he had betrayed the one person who had been honest with him. A poor black cleaner, a woman he had never even bothered to see, had been his last chance, his last hope, and he had thrown her away. He felt a profound, deep sense of regret. In the midst of the noise and the panic, with the government agents walking around him, he whispered a terrible truth to himself, a truth that felt heavier than all the money he had lost. She was right, and I threw her away. The mansion that had once been a symbol of Michael Harrington's power now felt like an empty, echoing cage. The government agents had left, taking with them all the important papers, all the secrets, and all the evidence of David's betrayal. They had also left him with a cold, devastating silence. The phone was no longer ringing with angry investors. The workers were gone, their jobs lost, their futures uncertain. There was no one left but him, a king in a ruined kingdom. He sat on the floor of his grand living room, the city lights below looking like a million tiny, taunting eyes. He wasn't in his expensive suit anymore. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and old jeans, clothes he hadn't worn in years. His face, usually so serious and commanding, was now pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. He was surrounded by old photo albums and stacks of pictures. He had spent the last 2 days pulling them out of a box in his library. They were filled with memories of him and David. A picture of them at their college graduation, 2 young men with big dreams and bigger smiles. A picture of them shaking hands in a messy office, a small paper sign on the door that said, Apex Innovations. A picture of them laughing, their arms around each other, celebrating their first big deal. He looked at those photos, and a terrible, lonely feeling settled in his chest. He wasn't just looking at pictures. He was looking at a lie. The smile on David's face in every single one of those pictures now looked like a mask. The friendship that he had believed was so strong, so real, was nothing more than a carefully crafted performance. He had been so proud. So sure of himself. He had built this company, this life, with his own 2 hands. He had been so blind. His pride had been a thick, dark wall, blocking out the truth. He had been so convinced that he knew everything, that he was so smart, so powerful, that he could never be fooled. He had looked at a woman who came from nothing, a cleaner who had dared to speak, and he had laughed at her. He had called her a liar and a gossip, and he had thrown her away. He had done all of that to protect a man who was now gone, a man who had stolen everything from him. For the first time in his life, Michael felt completely powerless. He had no more power, no more money, no more company. He was just a man in an empty mansion, a man who had been a fool. The weight of his pride, which had once felt so comfortable, now felt like a crushing burden. He had let his ego ruin his life. He had let the truth slip through his fingers because he had been too proud to hear it from someone he considered to be beneath him. he was filled with a mix of fury and self-loathing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break something. He wanted to go back in time and change everything, to stop himself from laughing at her, to listen to her, to believe her. But he couldn't. All he had now were the ruins of his life and the cold, hard reality of his own foolishness. He picked up a framed photo from the table. It was a picture of him and David, with their arms around each other. It was taken right after they had signed their first major deal, and they were smiling with a joy that had once seemed so genuine. He looked at the face of his best friend and felt a wave of cold, powerful rage. This was the man who had lied to him, who had used him, who had betrayed him in a way he had never thought possible. With a powerful scream that came from deep in his gut, a scream of frustration and pain and anger, he threw the framed photo against the wall. The glass shattered, the sound echoing through the silent mansion, a loud, final crash that broke the stillness. He stood up, his body shaking, and he looked at his reflection in the broken mirror on the wall. His face was a shattered mess, a reflection of the man he had become. A man who was broken and alone. He looked at his shattered reflection and whispered to himself, a terrible, desperate sound. She was right, and I threw her away. He closed his eyes, his heart a heavy, aching stone in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He had to find her. He had to find the one person who had been honest with him. He picked up his phone, his hands trembling. He had to find her. But he didn't know her name. He didn't know where she lived. All he knew was that she was a cleaner, and she was the only one who could help him. A new, desperate thought filled his mind. Where is she? I need her. The next morning, the grand, empty office building was filled with a different kind of silence. It wasn't the quiet of the night shift anymore. It was the tense, serious hush of a crime scene. Michael Harrington sat in the very same boardroom where he had made so many big, confident decisions, and now, he was listening to the terrible truth being laid out before him. 2 government investigators sat across from him, their faces grim and unreadable. They weren't here to scold him or to judge him. They were here to show him how deeply he had been fooled. They had spent the last 2 days piecing together a story of lies and deceit that went back years. The lead investigator, a sharp-looking woman with a serious face, slid a thick folder across the table. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice calm and professional. "We found them. The secret accounts. They were set up under shell companies, layers and layers of paperwork designed to hide who the money was really going to." She pulled out a large, detailed chart and placed it on the table. It was a complex web of lines and numbers, a map of betrayal. The map showed money moving from Apex Innovations, a little bit at a time, to other companies he had never heard of, companies with complicated, technical names that meant nothing to him. But the final destination of all the money, the very end of the line, was always the same, a bank account in a small country far away, a place known for keeping secrets. "These are offshore transfers," the man next to her said, his voice just as serious. "They've been happening for years. It's a method of moving large amounts of money without being noticed. A little at a time, so no one would ever suspect. We believe the total amount is in the tens of millions." Michael felt a terrible, cold sickness spread through his body. He wasn't just losing his company. He had been robbed, slowly and deliberately, by the one person he had trusted with everything. This wasn't a sudden crime. It was a long, planned-out betrayal. The man he called his brother had been a thief for years. The investigator opened another file. This one was filled with emails and text messages, a digital trail of lies. They were all from David. They were filled with secret code words and instructions to his accomplices, telling them when and where to move the money. Michael saw the names of his employees on the papers, people he had worked with for years. They were all in on the lie. They had all been a part of a fake world, a performance created just for him. "Project Phoenix," the woman said, her voice breaking his heart with every word. That was the name of the operation. It was a way to make it sound like a legitimate business venture. In reality, it was just the name of a bank account. A bank account where all the money was being sent. Michael looked at the documents. The image of David, the charming, smiling friend, crumbled into dust. He wasn't the backbone of the company. He wasn't his loyal partner. He was a con artist, a master manipulator who had been using him for years. The empire that Michael had been so proud of, the one he had built with his own hands, was just a lie. It had always been a lie, a house built on sand, designed to be torn down from the inside. He felt a rage, hot and powerful, rising in his chest. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the betrayal. It was about all the years he had wasted, all the trust he had given, all the faith he had put in a man who had been a snake in the grass. He thought about the day he had fired Sarah. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen a smiling face over a brave and honest one. He felt the tears sting his eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of pure, unadulterated fury. He looked at the investigators, his hands balled into fists on the table. He wasn't a helpless man anymore. He was a man who had lost everything, but he had a new mission. He had to find the one person who had been honest with him. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound a powerful, final crack in the silence. The investigators jumped, surprised by the sudden, raw display of anger. Michael's voice was a low, powerful growl. It wasn't the voice of a ruined billionaire. It was the voice of a man who was ready for a fight. "Find her," he said, the words filled with a terrible, desperate urgency. "Find her. Now." The world outside Michael Harrington's car was a blur of grey. The sky had opened up, and a heavy, relentless rain poured down, washing the streets of Chicago in a sad, reflective sheen. The windshield wipers worked furiously, but they couldn't keep up, and the world outside was a distorted, watery mess. He was a man who was used to being driven everywhere in a sleek, black car with a driver who knew the city like the back of his hand. But today, he was alone, behind the wheel of his own car, navigating streets he had only ever seen from the windows of a skyscraper. He had been looking for her for days. He had a team of investigators, the very same ones who had helped him uncover David's betrayal, and he had given them a simple, single instruction: find the cleaner. He didn't know her name. He only had her face in his mind, the face of a woman who had tried to save him. The investigators had given him a list of places to look, all of them in the parts of the city he had never bothered to see. These were the neighborhoods where the buildings were old and crumbling, where the streets were narrow and full of potholes, where the air smelled of wet asphalt and hard work. He drove past small, crowded apartment buildings, past laundromats with flickering lights, past small markets with handwritten signs on the doors. This was the world she lived in, the world he had never cared to know. He had started his search in the morning, a man on a mission, full of a powerful, desperate hope. But as the hours passed, as the day turned into a cold, rainy evening, that hope started to fade. The streets all looked the same. The people all looked like strangers. He felt like he was driving through a foreign country, a place where he didn't belong, a place where no one knew his name. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was a billionaire, a man who had commanded an army of workers, and he couldn't even find one person. The address the investigators had given him was just a number on a dark, wet street. He pulled over, his car a sleek, expensive object that looked completely out of place in this neighborhood. He got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking his clothes, but he didn't even notice. He had to find her. He had to make this right. He walked into a small, narrow building, the door creaking open with a sad groan. The air inside was humid and smelled of old cooking and wet clothes. He went up a flight of stairs, the wood groaning with every step he took. The hallways were dark and smelled of mildew. He stopped at a door, the number on the door a faint, peeling sticker. This was it. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. A small, confused-looking boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, opened the door. It was the same boy whose drawings Sarah had talked about. "Is Sarah here?" Michael asked, his voice a little too loud in the silence. The boy just stared at him, his eyes wide. A woman, an older woman with a tired but kind face, came to the door. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cautious. Michael explained who he was, and the woman's face turned into a hard mask. "There's no Sarah here," she said, her voice a final, firm period at the end of a sentence. The door closed, a soft, final click. He went to another address, and then another. The days turned into a week, and the week turned into 2. He drove through the same streets, over and over again, his car now a familiar sight to the people who lived there. He stopped at every laundromat he could find, walking in, his soaked clothes and his desperate face making him look more like a lost ghost than a powerful man. He would stand there, watching the clothes spin, looking at the faces of every woman who walked in, hoping to see hers. But he never did. The people he asked all told him the same thing: "We don't know her." He tried another address, this one an old, run-down building that looked like it was falling apart. He went to the last door on the 3rd floor, his hands shaking as he knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Sarah. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her clothes were simple and worn, a stark contrast to the elegant dresses she had worn to work. But her eyes, those tired, coffee-colored eyes, were just as he remembered them. They were wide with shock, and then with a hard, cold anger. She was scrubbing clothes in a large, plastic basin on the floor. Her hands, red and raw from the cold water, stopped moving. She looked at him, not with fear but with a deep, crushing contempt. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and sharp. "Sarah. I have to talk to you. I know you were telling the truth. I was so stupid. He took everything. He took it all. Please, you have to listen to me. I need your help. You were right." The words tumbled out of his mouth in a desperate, breathless rush. She didn't say a word. She just stared at him, her face a hard mask of pain and anger. The memory of the public humiliation, the tears, the feeling of being thrown away, it was all there in her eyes. She reached out and grabbed the doorknob. "Leave," she said, her voice a quiet, final command. She didn't give him a chance to say another word. She slammed the door in his face, the sound a loud, final crash in the quiet hallway. Michael just stood there for a long moment, the noise of the slamming door echoing in his ears. He was alone, and he was soaked, and he was a failure. He had been a fool, and now he was paying the price. The truth had finally caught up to him. He slowly sank to his knees outside her door, the hard, wet floor a cold slap of reality. The rain poured down on him, mixing with the tears he couldn't hold back. He was a billionaire, a man who had everything, and now he was begging in the rain, a desperate plea for a woman he had once seen as nothing more than a ghost. The rain continued to fall, a steady, mournful rhythm against the concrete. Sarah stood on the other side of her slammed door, her back pressed against the cold wood, her body shaking not from the cold, but from the raw anger that was bubbling up inside of her. She could still hear him, a soft, muffled plea coming from the other side. "Please, Sarah. I need to talk to you." She closed her eyes, and the memories came flooding back, as sharp and painful as a fresh wound. She remembered his face, the cruel, mocking laughter in his eyes as he had called her a liar. She remembered the word fired, a word that had taken away her ability to provide for her family, a word that had sent her into a world of panic and fear. She had been left with nothing, and he, the billionaire, the powerful CEO, had been the one who had done it. She heard him now, begging, and it was too much. She couldn't take it. She opened the door just a crack, the cool air from the hallway rushing in. He was on his knees, his clothes soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like a man who had lost everything, a man who was utterly defeated. His eyes, the once cold, distant blue, were now filled with a desperate, pleading sadness. "You laughed at me," she said, her voice a low, shaky cry. The words were filled with all the pain she had been holding in for weeks. "You fired me. You called me a liar in front of everyone. And now you want my forgiveness." She wasn't asking for an answer. She was stating the cold, hard, terrible truth of what had happened. "You threw me away like I was nothing. And now you're here, begging in the rain. What do you want from me?" He lowered his head, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, and his voice was barely a whisper, a sound full of a terrible, quiet shame. "You're right. You have every right to be angry. I was blind. I was so full of myself, so full of my own pride, that I couldn't see the truth even when it was standing right in front of me." He looked up at her, and his eyes, which had always been so confident and commanding, were now filled with a raw, honest humility she had never thought possible. "You were my only true friend, Sarah," he said, the words a confession of a terrible sin. "You were the only one who had the courage to tell me the truth. You saw it all, and you risked everything for me. And I mocked you. I pushed you away. I chose a lie over the most honest person I had ever met." He swallowed hard, and his voice cracked. "Please? I know I don't deserve it. But please, save me once more." His words hung in the air between them, a bridge of regret and a plea for redemption. He wasn't talking about money or business. He was talking about something much deeper. He was talking about a lost soul who had finally found the path to the truth, and he was asking the person he had wronged the most to show him the way back. Sarah looked at him. She saw the man she had laughed at, the man who had fired her in public, the man who had caused her so much pain. But she also saw something else. She saw a man who was truly broken. She saw a man who had lost everything and was now a stranger in his own life. The pride and the power were gone, washed away by the rain and the terrible truth of his betrayal. She saw a person who was standing in front of her, raw and defeated, and asking for a second chance. She looked into his eyes, and a profound silence settled between them. The anger was still there, but it was now mixed with a strange kind of pity. She saw the sincerity she never thought possible. His voice wasn't a trick. His tears weren't fake. He was genuinely broken. The billionaire CEO was gone, and in his place was just a man, lost and alone, begging for a second chance from the person he had hurt the most. The rain continued to fall, and she stood there, caught between the pain of the past and the uncertainty of a future she never could have imagined. What would she do? Would she turn her back on him and leave him in the rain? Or would she, a simple cleaner with a big heart, give him the forgiveness he so desperately craved? The rain had stopped, and the air was now filled with the clean, fresh scent of wet earth. Sarah stood there for a long time, looking at the broken man on his knees. The rage was still there, but it was now mixed with a deep, powerful pity. She saw the man she had met in the elevator, the powerful CEO, and she saw the man who was now begging at her door. He had lost everything, not because of her, but because of his own pride. She took a deep breath, and she knew what she had to do. Her mother's words, "Speak truth, even if your voice shakes," had guided her this far. Now, another part of her mother's lessons came to mind: forgiveness. Her mother had always taught her that holding on to hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It only hurt you. She reached out her hand and helped him to his feet. His body was still shaking, and he looked at her with a look of pure gratitude. He was a powerful man, and he was taking help from a simple cleaner. It was a moment that changed everything. "I forgive you," she said, her voice soft and clear. "You were blind. But now you see. And that's all that matters." He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and his eyes filled with a new kind of tears, tears of relief, tears of a man who had finally found the way back to the light. He knew that he had been given a second chance, not just at his company, but at his life. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Michael, with Sarah by his side, went to the government investigators. He gave them all the proof he had, all the information he had gathered, and he told them everything. He told them about David, about the secret accounts, and about how he had been blinded by pride. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to bring a man to justice, a man who had not only stolen from him but had also stolen from the workers who had depended on the company for their livelihoods. Then, he planned a press conference. It wasn't a grand, fancy event with expensive decorations. It was held in a simple room, with a few reporters and a small crowd of people. Michael, dressed in a simple, dark suit, stood at the podium. He wasn't there to talk about money or business deals. He was there to talk about the truth. He stood in front of the cameras, his face grim, and he told them everything. He told them about David's betrayal, about the secret accounts, and about how his company had been a house of cards. He was honest, and he was raw, and he didn't try to hide his shame. He was a different man now, a man who had been humbled by a terrible truth. Then, he looked at Sarah, who was standing in the back of the room, her hands clasped together, her face filled with a quiet strength. He had asked her to come. He wanted her there. He wanted the world to see the one person who had been his saving grace. He looked at the cameras, and his voice was filled with a powerful emotion. "I have to tell you the most important part of this story," he said. "I was blind. My pride and my power had made me so arrogant that I couldn't see the truth. I had a brave woman, a cleaner, who came to me and tried to warn me about my best friend. And I laughed at her. I called her a liar. I fired her in front of everyone, and I threw her away." He took a deep breath, and his voice cracked with a raw, honest humility. "She saved me," he said, his eyes on her. "Not just from a man who betrayed me, but from myself. She was the voice of truth, and I was too foolish to listen. I stand before you today, a man who has lost everything, but I have found something more important than any money. I have found a new kind of honesty, a new kind of humility." He then announced his plans. He was not only going to rebuild his company, but he was going to do it with her by his side. He officially appointed her as his personal advisor, a title that meant she would be his right hand, the one he would always listen to. He also made sure that her family was taken care of. He bought them a beautiful, new home, a place where her brother could study and her sister could paint without any worries. He made sure that her parents, who had worked so hard for so long, could finally rest. He ended the press conference with a promise to the world. He vowed to never again ignore the voices of the humble, the people who were so often unseen and unheard. He had learned a hard lesson, and he was now a different person. The camera closed in on Sarah's face. She wasn't a cleaner anymore. She was a woman of dignity and strength, a woman who had been through a fire and had come out on the other side, not burned, but shining. If this story touched your heart, please make sure to like this video so more people can see it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. And finally, before you leave, share this video with someone who needs hope, because you never know whose heart might be healed by a story like this.